Hi everyone, this is Professor Hall. Welcome to the Golden Age of Children's Literature, 1865 to 1926. So this is the first of two videos about the Golden Age. In this first video, we will trace some historical developments of children's literature. And then in the second video, we'll talk about some of the historical events and the cultural context that led to those changes. So let's get started. What is the Golden Age? Author Kenneth Grahame, who's probably now best known for The Wind in the Willows, wrote this book, The Golden Age, in 1895. It's a collection of childhood reminiscences that captures the imaginative and rebellious spirit of children navigating the adult world. So essentially, he thought of childhood as this golden age of life, and this book and its sequel have childhood as a distinct magical realm separate from adult concerns. In fact, the opening story of the Golden Age is called The Olympians, and it's all about adults as these like kind of mysterious, almost godlike people, and how they can't really relate to kids, right? So basically, scholars take this term, the Golden Age, and they extend it past the idea of just the Golden Age of life to this whole time period of literature. And in Britain, for the most part, we're in the Victorian period, starting with 1865. Many people place the beginning with the publication of Alice in Wonderland, though there are some books we're going to be looking at this week that fall outside this time period and start a little bit earlier. And then they mark the end as 1926, Winnie the Pooh was published that year. Other people kind of end this time period where the other literary time periods sort of end. In the United States, this time period extends from 1865 until World War I, and we're looking at realism, regionalism, and local color, which we'll talk about in later lectures. And then in World War I, we get into modernism, and then with World War II comes postmodernism. In Britain, this is the Victorian time period, which again usually ends with Queen Victoria's death or sometimes extends into World War I, although World War I up to 1926, we're looking at the Edwardian time period as well, because King Edward was in power as opposed to Queen Victoria. But regardless, this is a pivotal period in Britain, the US, and Canada, and stories from that time period written for children emphasized imagination, adventure, the child's perspective, and they're really pivotal to reshaping stories we know today. And they're some of the books I'll mention later, and some of the stories I'm sure you've heard of most of them, because this had such a large impact on our culture even now. So, early stories. Children's literature really begins with oral songs and stories passed down from generation to generation. So if you think about animal fables of India from about 200 AD, the one pictured here is the clever hare. There are also Aesop's fables, which were written on papyrus scrolls around 400 AD. You may have heard of some of those as well, such as the grasshopper and the ants. As we see here, the grasshopper was silly and foolish and wanted to sing all day, while the ants were industrious, preparing for the winter, right? So even in those stories, they're fun, but they're still meant to kind of teach a lesson, right? And this continues through the medieval time period. So monks are writing lesson books for children. We have De Septario, De Metris, Enigmatibus. Sorry for my butchering my Latin there, but that was an arithmetic book around the number 7. So everything had to do with the number 7. That's that sept right there. Focusing on the Bible, containing some riddles and puzzles written in Latin for children to solve, and it helped them to learn Latin, right? It's a little bit more fun way to learn. St. Bede is known for writing works for school, including books about grammar in the 600s, and there are also books on manners and morals as well during this time. Then we get into alphabet books, horn books, and primers. So this is a horn book. It is a wooden paddle with a sheet of vellum or paper covering this thin sheet of horn for protection. So that's why it was called a horn book. It had horn that was put on top, kind of like how we laminate things now. And basically, after this point, we have developments in printing, right? We have the Gutenberg press, and then printing becomes a little bit more standard. The horn books would have, if you can see here, I'll try to zoom in on this picture for you. There we go. It's a little blurry, but we've got our alphabet in uppercase and lowercase. We have some numbers here, and we have the Lord's Prayer as well. So some basic things that children would need to know as they learn to read, although literacy rates were still pretty low at that time. Primers, beginning in Boston around 1690. These are small books covered in wood, and basically they're the first textbooks for children in the American colonies. You can see it's a little bit damaged here, but it's the enlarged for easy attaining of the true reading of English, to which was added the Assembly of the Divine Catechism, which were some rules about the Bible or inspired by the Bible, things explaining the Bible rather. So primers then were created to help children learn to read and teach moral and religious lessons. Primers would, of course, again, include the alphabet, rhymes, prayers, the catechism, and rhymes inspired by the Bible. You can see a pattern here. Oh, there's an illustration from the Garden of Eden as helping kids learn their stories. Illustrations became more and more prominent. So we have chapbooks in the 1400s and 1500s. These were not originally intended for children, but they are shorter books that would feature poems and songs and stories. And then we have eventually some longer stories like The Legend of Robin Hood. Booksellers began to illustrate them, which made them more popular with children. We have Address to the Unfortunate Female and how she may be delivered from trouble and become truly happy. This is meant to be a moral lesson for adults, right? Not to give into temptation of lusts and fall on hard times and be, destitute and that kind of thing. Many of these didn't survive because they were written on cheap paper and sold for halfpennies, which is like a half penny in the street. Eventually, newspapers and actual books kind of take over the two different functions, right? Newspapers printed on much cheaper paper, and then books being a little bit more expensive. So eventually we come to this idea that we should tempt children to read. Why is that important? Well, the Puritans banned stories with fantastical creatures, so you couldn't have ogres or fairies or talking animals. They sort of thought of those things as being wicked and unbiblical. I actually know now a publisher that refuses to publish things with talking animals, sort of for this reason. But these were stories for children, but much of the time they weren't written down. So we actually get, during this golden age, some of the collections of fairy tales with like the Grimm's Brothers and the Blue Fairy Book and all of that kind of thing. But the opinions start to shift by the late 1600s. John Locke, in his Thoughts on Education, printed in 1691, suggests that when children begin to read, some easy, pleasant book like Aesop's Fables or Renard the Fox, with pictures if possible, should be put into their hands. And he wrote that we should tempt them to read, a thought that the Puritans would have really disliked, especially with that word tempt in there. And even into our time period, there was a big debate about novels and whether they were going to like rot your brain. Maybe you should be reading nonfiction only and learning lessons and not indulging in fictional stories. Then we have British publisher John Newbery, and he wants to make children's literature profitable, but he also thinks that they should not just be didactic, meaning for instruction only, but should also be fun. So we have here the Little Pea play, learning that letter. And we have an illustration of how to play hopscotch and a little discussion. First take the chalk an oblong square, blah, 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 blah. And then they have rules for life. Strive to make sense to stock your mind, and to that sense, be virtue joined. So we still have lessons, but it's a little bit more fun. And by the 1740s, he published over 30 children's books. He marketed them by selling them with a ball for boys or a pincushion for girls. So we have some engendered books there. But we also see, as I said, more illustrated books around that time. Then we have some of these early novels. Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan is a Christian allegory. A juvenile version is later created because it's really meant for moral instruction, but it's also a little bit interesting. And so it's not just, this person did such and such and then this happened to them. It's not strictly a moral tale. In 1714, we have Robinson Crusoe. It's a little bit didactic and not originally written for children, although it sort of becomes a children's book later. And then we have Gulliver's Travels in 1726. Again, a satire not originally written for children, although many children did read it later on and find it kind of fun and interesting. And there's a little bit of imagination there, even though we're satirizing some political situations and things of that nature. So we come to actual books for kids during the 1700s, and I think a great example of this is Goody Two Shoes, which was published by Newbery. And Goody Two Shoes is the protagonist in the full title is The History of Little Goody Two Shoes, and it was published in 1765. We follow Marjorie Meanwell. You can see the didactic nature even in her name, right? She means well. She's a poor orphan girl, and she only owns one shoe. A wealthy gentleman gifts her a complete pair, and she excitedly announces she has 2 shoes, earning her nickname. The story really emphasizes virtue, hard work, moral reward, as Marjorie becomes a teacher and marries a wealthy widower, and was published anonymously. Most people think it was Oliver Goldsmith who wrote the book. But this really sort of helped to shape the genre for, nearly 100 years, blending moral lessons with engaging storytelling. So this is 100 years before Alice in Wonderland. But we have someone who is excessively virtuous, a little self-righteous, but it is a story as well, right? And it is quite different from the tales that were being given to children, up until this point in the 1500s, 1600s. We're going to see an excerpt from this at the end of lecture 2. Forgot to put that picture in there. Rebellion! So, in our time period, there is a distinct shift away from didacticism, which is, moralizing and teaching, to imagination. We don't have just these moralistic lessons about obedience and virtue. The Golden Age really transforms this, and storytellers start embracing fantasy and adventure and whimsical storytelling. And yeah, we do have stories like Oz, The Wizard of Oz, which is not just one book, but really a whole slew of books by Baum. But we also and then we have things like Alice in Wonderland here with a cat that might be Dinah, might be Cheshire Cat, I'm not quite sure. But not all books are fantasies. We have some that take really great pains to depict childhood in a specific region or area, especially in the United States and Canada, as local color writers are doing the same thing for adults. But these stories are still whimsical and imaginative. Most of the moralizing is in the past. You do have some books that are sort of transitional, in my opinion, like Little Women, which is really trying to show girlhood and how the author grew up in pretty exact detail, but the girls in that book do learn distinct lessons in each chapter, and the The book sort of follows Pilgrim's Progress in a unique way. That's left out of a lot of the adaptations, but for the most part, we're leaving that in the past. We have industrial and social changes we'll talk about next time. But to sort of briefly overview them here, decreased infant mortality rates, increased literacy rates, expanding publishing industries, and evolving views on childhood that sort of demand books that entertain rather than simply instruct. And the idea of childhood as this distinct phase of life leads most of the narratives to celebrate things like innocence and wonder and escapism, as we talked about with Kenneth Graham's book, The Golden Age. So, some major themes. As I just said, escapism and adventure. Stories are let children leave behind structured, adult-controlled worlds and enter places of magic. I have this sort of theory that it's almost like kill all the parents or somehow get rid of them, because we have, before the child enters this magical world, somehow we have to sort of explain them away a little bit. So yeah, Neverland, Wonderland, Oz. We also have whimsical or pastoral locales, which are meaning like, great farmlands and small little villages and cozy cottages and things like that, with childlike anthropomorphized animals instead of people. So here we can think of like Beatrix Potter's stories, like depicted here with Peter Rabbit, books like Winnie the Pooh. Growth and identity is another major theme. You're going to hear this term again in this class, Bildungsroman, which basically means it's a coming-of-age story. So these could be physical changes, which we're going to see in The Secret Garden. They could be emotional changes, like we're going to see in Anne of Green Gables. But in any case, characters undergo often personal transformations as they grow and mature. You can also think of like Alice growing and shrinking throughout the book Alice in Wonderland, right? Another theme is freedom versus structure. Peter Pan presents childhood as eternal play. The ending of Huck Finn suggests that growing up means like embracing responsibility. And Mark Twain sort of suggests that people can just be on the frontier and escape civilization and kind of continue to play even as adults, in both the end of Tom Sawyer and the end of Huck Finn. We have a little bit of rejection of this idea of growing up and embracing civilizing structures. And imagination is power. Again, like Alice in Wonderland, creativity shapes reality, logic is thrown out the window, and we reinforce the importance of thinking beyond the ordinary and using your imagination and looking at your dreams and having this come out through play as well, which is super important. So these are some of the major works of this time period, and I'm gonna guess that you've heard of a lot of these, even if you're just familiar with some Disney movies, right? Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, Treasure Island, some we haven't mentioned, Heidi, The Secret Garden, The Little Princess, Tom Sawyer, and Huck Finn. As I mentioned here, Two Kids Fishing by Norman Rockwell sort of looks like Tom Sawyer. Anne of Green Gables, The Wind in the Willows, Winnie the Pooh, Little Women, The Jungle Book. So all of these like whimsical, fantastical stories, right, of adventure and imagination. And these are what we're going to look at this term. And I'm really just so excited to do that with you guys. Oh, there were also penny dreadfuls, and this isn't going to be part of this class, but I do want to mention them because children were not encouraged to read them, but they did anyway. Basically, these are mystery stories published as penny dreadful serials or yellowbacks, also known as sometimes as pulp novels. These are, at the time, cheap, sensationalized serial stories, usually featuring crime, horror, and adventure. So we do have like Treasure Island, which is sort of the more a little bit sanitized, although that book is dark as well, but it's meant for kids, right? These are much more in the romantic tradition. The Dance with Death, the Suffolk Gypsy, you can see over here in the pictures. And they were really aimed at working class readers, thrilling tales of detectives and criminals, supernatural beings, highwaymen. I mention these for two reasons. One, because it's clear that this type of fiction was not encouraged. So there were some sort of limits on what children were expected to be reading, right? It wasn't just like a free for all. But the second is a lot of our children in these stories are reading things like this and being inspired by them. Jo March in Little Women in particular is trying to write stories of this type and sort of be encouraged by people in her life not to do that, which is interesting to me. So as we go forward, consider some things. Why do stories from this time period still resonate with readers today? Why do we have tons of film and literary adaptations of like Peter Pan and Alice in Wonderland over and over and over again, right? The Wizard of Oz. They just had a horror movie based on Winnie the Pooh. Why is that? What is a child? We're going to talk about that next time. How do we define childhood today, and how did they define it in the past? What words or images do you associate with childhood that you might see in these books? Books today are really put into categories based on age. So we have like picture board books, really, and then picture books, then children's books, chapter books sometimes, middle grade, young adult, new adult, and then adult books. There are some lines between those, but with the publishing industry the way it is, that's really hardly delineated. Like there are people who will only publish middle grade, only young adult, that kind of thing. Where some of the books we've just talked about, like Anne of Green Gables or Treasure Island, maybe are sort of children's books, sort of middle grade, sort of young adult. Like they show a character growing and developing over a number of years. So they're harder, I think, to define. And then what are children's books like today? Are they filled with imaginative characters who just exist to tempt young readers into reading them? Or are authors still trying to teach a lesson of some kind? These are things I'd like you to think about sort of as you go through this class. And next time, as I said, we'll talk about some of the historical developments through this time period. Thanks, everybody.